And you can see my email and my WhatsApp mobile phone there, etc. And I want to thank Dana Duran of PLC Maine, Professional Logging Contractors of Maine, and Ted Wright of the Trusted Conserved Northeast Forest Lands, and Andrew Goldberg of Rainforest Alliance for providing some supporting info. But I should be clear that all of the slides and the information here is my sole responsibility. So if I make errors, they're mine. Let's go to the next slide, Connie.
Okay, let's try that. There we go. I hope it's switched on my computer.
Okay. Yep, it's there. It's there. It took a little lag, but it wasn't bad. So I will, obviously I'm an American, so I'll speak in American English. Apologies for that. But here's just a little bit of background. I'm not going to go through all of this because you can read it. Fundamental to my experience is that I started out with a liberal arts degree and then got more and more focused in the science. I have a master's of science and natural resources management. Peace Corps volunteer in Paraguay, long time experience there. There are almost 3 years. Worked in the for-profit sector. Then I got frustrated by that and I wanted to be out in the field. Went to Costa Rica and ran a project in the Osa Peninsula. If you haven't been there, go there. It's an amazing place, an amazing forest, Corcovado National Park and the areas around it, and also very interesting dynamics between forestry, gold mining, ecotourism, etc. Spent a couple years helping to set up the FSC and the consultation process around that with a woman who worked with me who was actually a grad assistant of mine at one point. I taught at the University of Vermont, a woman named Jamie Irvin, some of you may know, who's now I think at UNEP. And then Rainforest Alliance and I met each other, and I was there for unbelievably fast 27 years, which is scary. And since July 2019, I've been an independent advisor to both nonprofits and for-profits, focused on generally the topics we're talking about, but in particular, a lot of work on restoration now, and continued emphasis on accountability. And if you want to get a longer, hopefully not boring kind of conversation on where I am today and how I got here based on my family and all those things, there's a earth.live is a new kind of interface that I'd recommend. There are other great interviews there. You may not even want to look at mine. Andrew Dudley out of California runs that. He's actually originally from the UK. But worth looking at earth.live, and there's more of my personal background there, and also some discussions around restoration. Next slide, Connie.
Sorry, okay, I will. But does anyone know why those lines? Are you seeing those lines showing up?
I'm seeing them, but I don't think they detract much, Connie. I wouldn't worry about them. It may be
okay. Yeah, but there are more and more of them coming. So I see a Pamela Del Please something.
There we go.
Okay, well, let's hope that stops.
That's kind of weird, but whatever. I do have, as everyone does, a personal philosophy. This stuff matters to me. I've been a forest auditor for many years. So I'll walk through these fairly quickly. Actions speak louder than words. Words do matter. Walk in other people's shoes. Always take a step back and try to think what's motivating other people to do what they're doing. I am politically independent. I'm actually, despite being in a very green state, I still have at times conservative values on budget and all those kinds of things. Foreign languages, I've been lucky. I speak pretty much fluent Spanish, decent Portuguese, and I used to speak fluent Guarani, but not anymore. It's a lingua franca in the Amazon basin. Given finite resources, this was instructive. It was really important. I got this input early on when we were creating the FSC. Invest your time and resources in leaders, whether they're introverts or extroverts, in all sectors. They're the agents of change. Why was that important? Because initially there was kind of a momentum. Oh, let's involve everybody. Let's reach out to even the Darth Vader companies. Let's reach out to government. And actually people from government and companies said to me, Richard, no, invest in the people that are the leaders. They're going to cause the change. You have limited resources. The first grant for establishing the FSC was only $50,000 from the MacArthur Foundation. Don't waste those resources on people that are just not going to easily change initially. Invest in the leaders. Be open-minded and non-dogmatic. In fact, question dogma. I think that's true on everything we talk about. Question authority, but be respectful and respect wisdom. Oddly enough, I find that I respect the wisdom of elders even more now being an elder than I did before. Not my own wisdom, but that of others. Welcome surprises, which sometimes isn't so fun, but it's just what you got to do. And innovate or die. Maybe that's a little overly dramatic, but I do think that with all of the certification systems, et cetera, out there, if they don't continue to innovate, honestly, they will see attrition. They will not be successful. Next slide. I will have, as we're going through this, a little bit of audience in theory interaction, but it won't be too much until we get to the end of the presentation. Then we'll do more. But I wanted to just forewarn you, there'll be a couple points in time where I may ask you to raise your hand on a certain thing if you were involved in a certain thing. So one of the things Connie and I talked about in prep for this was to try to address two main issues and see what my perspective is on those. One being equity, the other being equitable access. The easier one in some respects is equitable access. Easy to say, hard to do, which means having open and equal access to resources, rights, and technology, regardless of an ethnicity, socioeconomic status, age, physical ability, or any other personal quality. That's sometimes easier said than done, but I do think it's something that we all can, we have a sense of what that means. Equity is a tougher one. Because though society in some respects continues to make steps towards equality, but being equal and fair is not always so straightforward. I don't find it as straightforward. Sometimes people need differing treatment to make their opportunities the same as others. So you may have different incentives, different approaches in different cultures. And equity may not mean equal. So one of the things that I have felt when I looked at equity and I thought about it, and I got on a couple dictionaries and other things to look at their definition of equity, and what kind of responded to me was the idea that equity is fairest when it's proportional to relative investment. In other words, if you're not willing to make the investment, well, then how much can you ask for fairness if you're not willing to invest in it as you, with the resources you have, make relative investments. Making commitments, history, family, community, and we have all sorts of examples of situations where family, community, even gender, etc., all limit the ability for equity. And felt impact. And the felt impact, to me, the best distinction I can give is that in the FSC system, sometimes there's a discussion around stakeholders. Are they directly affected or indirectly affected? And there's a whole discussion about, well, wait a minute, who are the directly and the indirectly? And should we pay as much attention to those people that, for example, have customary rights and tenure on a particular forest area? Should we pay as much attention to indirect effect, which might be NGOs that are in a capital city or long far away? I think by the end of this, you'll get a sense of where I come from on that, but that's an open discussion, I think. Juggling these are not easy. There's no perfect solution. I'm going to give you two options for moving in this direction. And at the end of the day, I'm going to come back to this question. Do you think these examples demonstrate some attempt to better address equity and equitable access? Next slide. So the two options I'm going to go through are one, a global initiative that has begun recently on logger or forest contractor certification. I'll go into more details on that. And the second is something that I've been working on for probably almost 3 to 4 years now, maybe even longer, is smallholder access, and in particular, a particular model that we are actually testing. They're both live right now as we speak. They haven't come to their conclusion, but I'll give these two examples and use them as a basis for further conversation with you all. Next slide. So I'm going to start out with a question, which maybe raising a hand might be a good way to getting an indication from you, or at least virtually, Connie and Yavindra, we can get a sense, Yavindra, we can see how people say. First, a question to you. How many of you logged? How many of you used a chainsaw? How many of you planted trees, thinned a forest or pruned a tree or driven a tractor or a big truck? Or are you related to a logger? I'm going to go into some of my links, but maybe raise your hand if you've done some of that, so I get a sense of what kind of.
I can't raise my hand, but I would. I just technically can't.
That's fine.
Okay.
That's fine. Well, hey, look at the hand.
Oh,
That's fantastic. There you go. Fantastic. So, I will say that that's great to see. And I'll be honest, on one of these questions, for example, I've done almost all of these. I've never driven a big truck. I only started driving a tractor when I was about 45 years old. I never actually did that in a business construct. So it was later in life. I am related to a logger. My grandfather on my mother's side was a logger and a sawmill owner. From when I came back from Peace Corps in '78, I worked as an independent tree feller, and I continue to fell trees even today for my own firewood. We use about 3 to 4 cords a year, which is, I think, what, 6 to 8 cubic meters a year at the house here in Vermont. I helped create the FSC, but I bring that baggage, if you want to refer to it as that, of being related to people that have worked in the forestry sector with me, and that has always influenced my thinking. Around 2000, after engaging in FSC certification, I was struck by the lack of FSC engagement with loggers. I felt that all the forest certification systems were in a way disrespecting them. There was almost no attention in some of those systems on smallholders, though FSC began to get the message in the middle of the 1990s and started to work on new models. Now, as I go this part, I'm now going to go into forest contractors and loggers a little bit more. You're going to see a little bit about a model called Master Logger Certification, which was started by the Professional Logging Contractors of Maine, and then transferred to the Trust to Conserve Northeast Forest Lands, a nonprofit based in Maine, in 2003. And I've been interacting with them since that time. After a lot of internal discussion, and I'll be honest, it took me 5 years to get the team at Smartwood and Rainforest Alliance to support the idea of certifying loggers, performance-based certification of loggers, not credential-based, performance-based. And the idea wasn't consistently welcomed. And this points to issues on the social side, on how the forestry profession sometimes thinks of loggers, and vice versa, how loggers think of foresters, which maybe that'll come out in the conversation. But in 2007, we designed, frankly, I pushed a lot, and we got a new Smart Logger certification model in place, and our first certificate was to the Trust to Conserve Northeast Forest Lands. And the head of the trust, Ted Wright, is now actually a member of the board of directors of FSC US. And I continue to interact with him on basically a weekly basis. Next slide, Connie. So the intent of this slide is to give you a sense of, when you look at occupations comparable to loggers, in terms of the kind of the skills that they require, just to give you a feeling of where they are on the skill on the wage side, in particular the wage side. And you'll see, because it's the bottom one, logging equipment operators aren't exactly paid very well in most situations. Of course, there are country by country differences. But one of the things that the Professional Logging Contractors of Maine and the Trust were both wanting to do, to the maximum extent they could, was to use certification to leverage or recognize better performance, gain credibility for loggers in the sector and also amongst the public, maybe see if it could create higher log payments and higher wages and better livelihoods for loggers. And they've already had a bit of success. I'll come back to I think at the end we should come back to the question of the role of loggers in society and logging, because they're quite disparate perspectives and perceptions there. But one of the things they've been able to do is here in the United States, on a state-specific basis, we have something called workers' compensation, and literally every employer pays into that pool on an annual basis in every state, and then that money is used to pay for insurance for people that are hurt in their business, in their job, and what the trust and PLC have been able to do is reduce those workers' compensation payments for loggers in the state of Vermont, the state of Maine, and I think the state of New Hampshire, and they keep working on it. So one of the things this points to is that when certification sometimes is a vehicle and not the end desire or the end result, but rather a vehicle for better organization of organizations to achieve diverse aims. And I was fortunate before this call, an old friend, John Palmer, sent me a couple articles. I think many of you know John. And one of the questions here is, how do you create more value, more benefits for everyone who's engaged? And I sometimes think that we look to certification first, and in fact, we shouldn't. We should look at how we can support good local organizations and use certification as a vehicle to achieve that, as one of the vehicles for achieving that, and then build on that. And then maybe you get a positive dynamic with certification in small landowners or loggers. But if you kind of go at it, we'd say in American backwards, where you go to certification first and then go to the second part of supporting local organizations second, that can be a fundamental error. Next slide. Oh, what's going on here?
Are you not seeing it? Because it's
oh, there it is.
Okay.
Yep, there's just a little lag there. So this is what Master Logger, how it's been organized by the Trust to Conserve Northeast Forest Lands in partnership with the Professional Logging Contractors of Maine. And so they developed, what is really important to note is that this is performance based. It's not, oh, I got a training course. See, I got my training certificate, therefore I'm okay. No. This is about actual assessment of performance in the field. And so that's the kind of program that Master Logger has created. It's now active in a whole bunch of states, but it's also expanding. So I'm not going to go into more detail here other than to note one thing. In the bottom under updates, you'll see on the left-hand side there after the yellow update, you'll see contractor certification. There's been a whole discussion about, well, wait a minute, should this all be just about logger certification, or should it be about quote unquote forest contractors? So let's go to the next slide. Because in every country, there's a little difference as to who forest contractors are. In the United States, this tends to be mostly a discussion around actual loggers. In Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, other places, actual forest contractors may do everything from planting trees to tending those trees by either thinning or pruning, to chemical applications, to building roads, and all those may be separately contracted out by a landowner or a large company that owns the rights to a forest, or even a community. So here's kind of the subject areas under logger certification. What the trust and PLC and yours truly, myself as an advisor, are a pro bono advisor right now. I'm helping them to get attention, get support for recognizing good forest contractors in the global certification world and in supply chains. So on the left, you see what Preferred by Nature, formerly called NEPCON. It's a certification body in the FSC system, and also they do PEFC. And they developed, I developed that program, and then Preferred by Nature inherited that program about 3 years ago. They called smart logging, and these are the areas of the topics that the standard focuses on. Master Logger, developed by the trust and others. Here are the categories of issues that they focus on. Some of the things that seem to matter the most are not as explicit in either of those standards as they could be, but I'll come back to that in a subsequent slide. And just so you know, thanks to people making comments under the chat, but I'm not going to look at the chat box myself until the end of the presentation, because I think we have a significant amount of time to go back and forth and talk about things. So let's go to the next slide. And by the way, you can look on the websites for both of these, Preferred by Nature and the Trust, to get the really detailed indicators that they use in their standards. Those are just the subject areas. So as I referred to before, one of the key questions and the current state of play on this is that, well, wait a minute, who are forest contractors? And it's not just loggers. And this has been emphasized in a number of the different countries we've been talking to, that we shouldn't just be talking about loggers. We should also be talking about tree fellers, planters, chemical appliers, maybe even truckers, thinners, pruners, and this depends on the country. Secondly, what the Trust and PLC are right now in the midst of trying to organize is a global network of responsible forest contractors, and they want to expand national level performance-based certification programs or systems. And the countries involved in this dialogue, which is quite live, we do conference calls every month that Dana Duran of PLC organizes. But so far, the countries involved have been Australia, Colombia, Finland, Japan, New Zealand, South Africa, Sweden, and the USA. That is expanding. We've had some interaction, for example, with a similar group in Ireland, in Chile, in Brazil, etc. So the opportunity here is big. And actually, if you have suggestions on people or organizations you think we should be in touch with, just send me an email and then I'll get you in the loop, and I'll also make sure that Dana and Ted are aware of you. There is engagement with both the FSC and PEFC certification systems. The concrete examples, there is actually a PEFC forest contractor certification program in Sweden that has been developed and is ongoing. And then Master Logger and Ted and Dana are trying to move through a contractor certification model in the FSC certification system. Fits and starts not so smooth at times, but it seems to be going the right direction. Next slide. So some key questions in play for forest contractor logger certification. And the first one is a big one. In particular, in some countries, loggers are seen as Darth Vader. They are seen typically, you don't hear about them except in a negative context. So will the public accept the notion that logging is actually an acceptable activity and lifestyle or occupation? In a society focused on sustainability and what I refer to as renewability, you have an ultimately highly renewable resource if it's done right. But in order to take advantage of it, guess what? Somebody at some point has to fell a tree. So we'll see. Secondly, the Trust and the PLC initiative explicitly in the values that they're working on a value statement, and they've been quite explicit in saying that they want the standards need to be adjusted and the approach to ensure that there is support for the rights of indigenous peoples, protection of high conservation values, free, prior, and informed consent, improving silviculture and reduced impact logging techniques, and independent third-party performance-based auditing. Now, will that prove viable for the logging sector with all of these organizations involved? That's a big question. What are the benefits for loggers and forest contractors to engage? Many of them want credibility, and I'd go back to the beginning of the FSC. There's always a discussion. Well, was FSC just a market tool, or was it about something else? As a founding member, I can say to you that for me, FSC was not just about the marketplace. It was also to recognize good forest managers from where I sit. Many of you may disagree with me on that, but I was there. I felt one of the things I was interested in was using a credible tool to recognize the good loggers, because there was a lot of public relations info out there, either negatively or positively, about the forest sector, and I wanted to cut through the garbage. And I saw certification as a way of recognizing good players. Now, could it have a market impact? Yeah, sure, positive. Let's try to do that. But I saw the first focus being on recognition of good performers. Others may disagree with me on that. Um, so the other things that I think loggers want in this process is they want their livelihoods to improve, better pay, because theirs is a high risk profession. You look at the numbers on accident rates in almost every country where there's logging, and loggers are among the most high risk professions, and historically a low wage occupation. Again, there are exceptions to that, but that's the problem. What are the incentives? So is it a better price per ton delivered, i.e. a green premium for well-managed, well-harvested timber? Is it a priority of purchase that during lean times, X mill will prioritize buying from me because I've engaged on certification or I'm a better performer? Is there payment or other support for training? Access to low-cost liability or health insurance, like I talked about before, or maybe just better organized public relations. And lastly, can the proposed system be structured to efficiently build on legal requirements? Because all countries have laws related to natural resources, some of them quite specific, some of them not so much. And can we design an auditing certification system which is realistic in terms of keeping costs down and preventing auditing fatigue? Next slide, Connie. I think we're going to make a transition here, I hope. There we go. And I think, am I doing okay, Yavendra and Connie, on time? Are we okay?
On track.
We're on track. Okay. And I'm going to try to get the rest of this done in about 10 minutes so that we can then just.
That would be good.
Perfect. Yeah. Perfect. So we can then get into conversation and then I'll look at the chat box. So the next example I'm going to give you is something called the Appalachian Woodlands Alliance Project, which developed something called the Smallholder Access Program. So after basically where we are now is we've had about 30 years of experience with forest certification. Organic certification, by the way, goes way back, much earlier, as does the National Tree Farm Program certification program here in the United States, which goes back to the 1940s. But global forest certification really started in the late 80s, the early 90s. Next slide. So the Smallholder Access Program was designed to address the challenge of engaging very small landowners in a different model, recognizing, for example, that many small landowners, and I'm just going to use the case of the United States here, is that many of them, they look and they use their forest as a savings bank. And every once in a while they go in, they'll do a commercial harvest. They may not, other than a little bit of firewood, they may not be harvesting at all in their forest every year. They might only do it every 10, 20, 30, 40 years. But they tend to do it around the time when somebody needs to go to college or university, or somebody needs to make a family investment in order to improve their livelihood. In this particular case, we ascribed a maximum size for the SAP to be applied to 100 hectares, or about 250 acres here in the United States. Under the FSC system, there's something called small and low intensity managed forest threshold, which is 1,000 hectares. So we went to 1/10 of that. That may be the kind of calculus for other landscapes. We'll see. There are SLIMF thresholds established in many countries. So we'll see how applicable this might or might not be. The original request to design SAP was made in 2016 when I was at Rainforest Alliance by companies that were sourcing in the target region. You're going to see the target region in a map here in a sec. The companies involved were Avery Dennison, which is the largest label maker in the world. Clearwater Paper makes a lot of packaging. Columbia Forest Products does high-end plywood. Domtar is a paper company, but also getting into alternative uses of fiber. Evergreen Packaging, name says clear what they do. Kimberly-Clark, from consumer goods like diapers and toilet paper, and Staples, which is a big office supply retailer here in the United States. These companies, we did organize and get financial support from them We also got some support from the U.S. Forest Service for the AWA project. The SAP, we initially started to design it based on a brainstorm I had. And then when the FSC started its new approaches initiative, we glommed onto that, and it became a tool for certification, potentially, that FSC might endorse. There are 2 full-time AWA staff. If you ever want to have interaction, they're great, Andrew Goldberg and Ashley Hawk. And then there's a steering group running the project. Rainforest Alliance asked me to be on that steering group for them. Amy Eagle from FSC US and Vera Santos from FSC International, who's based out of Portugal. There's also a technical committee, which is multiple specialists from NGOs and forest management organizations. And the FSC accredited certification body for both of the pilots that were approved, which you're going to see in a sec, were both already being audited by Preferred by Nature or NEPCON. So that was the FSC system response, was that this needs to fit within the FSC system. Next slide, Connie. So there you get a picture of the landscape that this is operational in. It's in what we would refer to as kind of the foothills region of the Appalachia, southern central Appalachia. 60% of the forests in this region are privately held versus national forests or state forests. So they're privately held by landowners of different sizes. 75% of those private ownerships are less than 100 hectares or 250 acres. And this is the key one to me. 50% of the commercial wood supply, for example, for Domtar, and in the case of Columbia Forest Products, 90% of their wood supply comes from this ownership category, meaning properties less than 100 hectares. So a lot of these aren't engaged, and yet a big chunk of supply comes from them. To date, for example, FSC hasn't even reached 0.1% of those smallholders. And even the long-standing American Tree Farm System, ATFS, covers less than the highest that they've gotten to in any individual state involved here has been 10%. And they haven't significantly nudged that. There's attempts to do that now. We'll see how successful they are. They're innovating. They're doing a lot of good stuff to try to change this. And I interact with them all the time. But it's still a challenge. It's still, how do you engage landowners in this category in what are the benefits? How do you get them involved? Next slide, Connie. So here's a map. You can see it goes to western West Virginia. In the south, it goes as far south as northern Georgia and South Carolina. You've got Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, and Kentucky. This region this area was selected based on interaction with a couple of the priority companies we were working with and their sourcing area. So this gives you a sense of where the geography is. Next slide. So the idea here was designed to reach, as I said already, these very small private woodland owners. We did a couple different things. First, we said, let's focus this system on the point of harvest activity, i.e. when logging is happening. And let's go to critical criteria. And those that based on 25, 30 years of FSC and actually SFI, Sustainable Forestry Initiative, or PEFC, or American Tree Farm, we actually engaged with those organizations to identify, well, what are the really critical issues when you look at the menu? Let's look at the FSC full list of criteria and indicators, principles and criteria, and look at that as a menu. When we look at that menu, and we've got many in the US national standard for FSC, it's literally hundreds of indicators. What are the really critical ones that matter? And if we're going to take this to a harvest level, and for specifically this landowner class, I hypothesized that we could reduce it to a prioritization of 10 to 15 indicators that mattered the most. that really dictated what was good management in this specific project area and for this class of landowner. That was the hypothesis when we started to design it. Next slide. So a couple of characteristics of this region. First, there's relatively low intensity forest management. This isn't the coastal intensive large scale plantations of Southern Georgia, Eastern Carolinas, et cetera, that you may see on in a number of presentations. Harvests here are typically once every 40 to 60 years, sometimes a little bit less than that. Timber stand improvements, meaning going into thin, are difficult to be cost effective unless there's subsidies. And there's little to no site disturbing activity in interim years, unless there's a small firewood harvest. Natural regeneration predominates in this region. There are both evergreen, pine species and spruce, and also lots of natural hardwoods. But natural regeneration of hardwoods dominates. For this woodland owner cohort or group, again, under 100 hectares, the value of certification as currently designed rarely justifies the cost or the long-term commitments required. So there's a disconnect between what the systems are requiring and this particular woodland owner cohort. Next slide. So the FSC intention was to improve common practice, forest practice for this class of landowner. And it kind of something we always were constantly saying and still say today is it should look like a typical FSC operation. So in order to foster that and make this less risk aversive, or make it risk aversive, excuse me, was that we would require for the certificate holders involved to already have an FSC group forest management certification, but with the a new scope area, which would be the smallholder access program. So we'd build on that existing experience and credibility. They already know FSC, and they know what the values and expectations of FSC forest management certification are. So if you look on the left, we did a couple of different things. First, we did not require a detailed forest management plan. If they had it, great. But what we required more was a robust harvest plan, identifying where the harvest would happen, where your skid trails would be, your access roads, etc. And so then we get to point of harvest. We looked at the point of harvest plus 6 months for clear requirements for monitoring, explicit landowner acknowledgement, protection of RTEs, rare, threatened, endangered species, some regional HCVs that are of particular importance, disallow high grading, and you can see another of the last one is particularly important in this landscape, which is keeping forests as forests. Land prices are going up, and there's increasing desire to subdivide lands and sell them for development. Next slide. So where does it stand? Well, our approved pilot period will end December 31st, 2021, and the AWA project ends at the same time. Pilot certifications were approved for the existing expansion of scope for the existing group FMs, group forest managers, certified by that are Evergreen Forest Products and Columbia Forest Products. Through, in this case, their auditor was Preferred by Nature. They already had them as their FSC auditor, but there was also additional approval for the SAP pilot test. FSC International had to approve it separately. 12 pilot certified harvest sites have been harvested on. More are pending. They've covered 1,000 plus acres, about 400 hectares. After going through FSC auditor training, actually Andrew and Ashley both did second party audits to see how it was going. And then Preferred Nature conducted their normal annual FSC or performance audit of the group FMs, including the properties under the SAP scope. And then 2 independent technical specialists conducted an additional third-party field performance audit. For the pilot period, all of the harvested product is considered FSC certified material during the project period. But in order to be sold as certified, there have to be approved chain of custody operations in place that are processing it. Next slide. I can see more comments coming up in the chat, but I'm not gonna hit those yet because I haven't read them completely. Go ahead, Connie, next slide. Key questions at play. What will the FSC do with SAP based on what seem to be pretty positive pilot results in terms of this is resulting in harvest and management, which is equivalent to FSC forest management certification, again, for this class of landowner. Secondly, how do you financially support the foundational work that needs to be done to design SAP for another jurisdiction? You have to do corrective action request analysis for certificates that have been done either under FSC, American Tree Farm, or SFI. You got to outreach and discuss with stakeholders, social, environmental, business, state government, et cetera. And how do you test it? How do you package that and do that and get the cost of that covered on an ongoing basis? The biggest, heaviest lifting is at the beginning. And then what benefits? It all comes around to, will buyers bring to the table to attract small landowners and encourage these companies and certificate holders to engage with this class of landowner? Is it a pricing issue? Is it a priority purchasing issue? Is it technical assistance from the certificate holder to the smallholder? Other values? And lastly, could this be applicable for other situations? And I've been exposed to what's happening with smallholder rubber in Southeast Asia. And it could be that this could be a potentially good model for there. I think that's my last slide. Keep going, Connie. All right, final comments, and then we'll just open it up. New generation certification systems must capitalize on the past 30 years and keep innovating and changing. I've hit that message repeatedly. Certification experience is valuable. And of course, certification systems need to improve, but I would suggest that perhaps even more importantly, certification has influenced supply chains accountability, different types of first, second, or third party due diligence, which is not certification, but is still, it's influenced those. It's focused on key issues that are now being incorporated more consistently in supply chain discussions like free, prior, and informed consent, protection, conservation of HGVs, and recognition of smallholders. And lastly, for a more sustainable, renewable society, will these initiatives, either of them, impact long-held negative perceptions of loggers, even foresters, and the forest product sector? Given there are no perfect solutions, do the above examples contribute to improving or seem to help improving equity and equitable access? So let's discuss. I'm going to now open up my comments that I've seen, the comments that you've submitted. But Connie and Yavinder, you can also facilitate this conversation up until the time we need to stop. So I'm here. I'm flexible. Look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Richard. Yeah, I've just stopped the screen share so that I can see the comments and everything else that's going on. And yeah, let's open up to comments. We could. There are quite a few comments, so we could start at the top and yeah, see how we go. So what we often do is I'll just ask the person. Well, you have a choice if you want to articulate verbally, or I can read out your comments. So I see something from John Balmer. Hi, John. Would you like to make a comment now? And feel free to turn on your camera if you like. It's not required, but
yeah, it's more fun for me if you turn on your camera, and obviously unmute yourself.
Yeah.
So I've unmuted myself, but you won't want to see my face this morning. It's Vancouver time.
There you go. Go for it, John.
I certainly agree that we need to have a much broader approach to be more inclusive. And I know that you've read Steve Mitchell's papers from Southeast Asia, where he is pointing out that millions of smallholder foresters are currently out with all the certification schemes because they simply don't match the local reality. Yeah. So starting with your contractors, it's clear that in some countries, in the state of Maine and in Sweden, we have well-established contractor certification systems which have legal backing.
That's right.
And it's quite clear what is the responsibility of the local forest manager and what is the legal responsibility of the contractor. The problem with FSC, and I'm not sure about PFC, the problem with FSC at the moment is that it is muddled, and the new approaches program appears to be not addressing the problem of when there is a corrective action request delivered by an auditor, who is legally responsible for responding. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll give a quick response and realize there are a bunch of other people who have a ton of experience on the call here. So don't take my answer as the Bible. There's a lot of different perspectives on these. An observation I would make also, John, here in the United States is that actually on legality, states approach things in different ways. In some cases, there are forest practices rules or requirements, and very specific requirements, what we refer to as best management practices, which originally were voluntary and in fact in some states have actually become legal requirements. That's not necessarily true across the board. So New Hampshire is different from Vermont, is different from Maine, is different, etc. So realize that clear linkage between what master logger is trying to do and legal requirements in a particular state may actually differ from state to state. As a forest auditor, for me, it's always really clear. I'm not sure I'd refer to it as it is a legal responsibility in the sense that the certificate holder is the one with the responsibility. And because there's a legal contract that happens there between the certifier and the certified operation. So that's legal, but relatively speaking, you also have local agencies that indeed are responsible for legal actions. And actually in some states, loggers are very strictly controlled in terms of, we have something here in the state of Vermont called the heavy cut law. And actually the loggers are on the docket for that. They have to indicate that they're meeting the requirements of the law, they as loggers. Now that's not part of certification directly per se, but just so you know. So I agree on the point. I think it is important from an auditor point of view, having worked at an FSCCB for many years, it's clear to me who the responsible party is when we grant a certificate. But beyond that, I think it will depend on the local circumstances and what the legal system is. So maybe we go to thanks, John, and other observations we can do offline too. So this is good stuff. Where do you want to go next, Connie?
Yeah, so next is Marion Carmen from FSC International. Hi, Marion. Yeah.
Hi.
Hey, Marion.
Hi, Richard. Hi, Connie. Hi, John. Yeah, well, I have a more philosophical question. And the thing is also, I'm working for FSC, but I did my 9 hours today, so I'm already on weekend mood. And my question, or perhaps it's more a reminder or observation. I studied forestry, and it's a kind of close to nature forestry in Germany. And when I started to work internationally and I heard the term logger, I always wondered what the hell you mean, because people refer to logging when they talk about forestry. Logging is only one little step of a big thing.
That's right.
Yes, you did explain it, but it took me long, and I read, I don't know, a year ago, the book from Annie Proulx.
Oh yeah,
if the French pronunciation is right. Barkskin. It's
I'm in
about,
the middle of reading it.
It's about exploiting forests. Exploiting again in the way we German use it. Overusing, creaming off the best stuff, leaving the rest, if at all. From this book, I learned that there's really a big difference in the understanding of what forestry can mean in different countries. And I think it has to do that we, at least in the old German system, we learned about uneven-aged forest management.
That's right.
And only the moment you go to more even-aged management, or perhaps to very small plots, you can talk about this different profession of loggers compared to forestry. And that's this difference between perhaps the US or the plantation perspective compared to what I think good forestry is what I want to tell you.
Yeah, well, thanks, Marion, and we've known each other a long time, so I know
Yes.
I have some sense of where your values are, and you and I tend to be on the same page on most of them, would be my guess. But that said, one of the interesting things in Barkskins, and I recommend the book. It's a long book, and I'm now in the final chapters of it, so I'm enjoying it. But one of the points they make is how important forest is for non-timber reasons. Collection of all sorts of non-timber forest products, and the way that the Micmacs and others approach forest management. And logging, at least in most of it, has a very strong negative connotation, and in many cases, I think for good reasons. But I think what matters is we think. I'm looking right now at sustainable biomass, and people are saying, well, we shouldn't be harvesting trees and using them for energy. And again, people want to take a perspective from a particular place and impose that everywhere. And I'm not smart enough to do that anymore. I now want to say, wait a minute, what are the implications for wood energy based on an uneven managed forest in the northeastern United States? I would like to see, for example, I'm not sure anybody's ever done a master's or PhD on the impact of FSC focusing on things like coarse woody debris, free, prior, and informed consent, uneven age management. How has FSC actually affected commercial forest management in places that historically, it used to be, oh no, if it's a forest, it's got to be clean underneath. Well, no, wait, a messy forest is okay, because that brings all sorts of other values into the picture. So I think and there are loggers that don't see that picture, don't understand that, and there are loggers that do see that picture. And I think where the trust and PLC want to take the logging profession is to recognizing those different values, and the historic. I mean, loggers and indigenous people in many locations have not gotten along well. It's been very negative dynamics in many places. There are exceptions to that, and what we want is the exceptions to be the rule. At least that's philosophically where I'm coming from. But I think it really is important. And when you look at the United States, it's a big country. There's lots of different places where management is happening. The southeastern US is probably the place that has been most talked about in terms of large scale pine management, which is even aged and has many implications and lots of challenges. So coming back to my point, though, is whether or not the FSC, this SAP model, it takes over 250 indicators and literally reduces it to 20 or 15. Will FSC, and it looks like the end result is a decent, well-managed forest for this class of landowners, but it doesn't require a forest management plan. Oh, the foundations, are shaking in the forestry community, because if you don't have a forest management plan, God help us, or things like that. And I'm not on one end or the other of that. I just see what's happening as performance in the field is what matters. And I want to get the noise out of the way and focus on the things that matter the most. And that's what we should be certifying from where I sit. I know I'm not the only person in the team trying to figure this out, but that's where I'm coming from. And for this class of landowners, focusing on a much smaller number of indicators is, for me, where it has to go. Otherwise, it is just patently unsustainable for them. So thanks, Marion. Good stuff. And I'm sorry to keep you late.
That's voluntarily, fully.
I know.
Enjoy it.
I know that. Go ahead, Connie.
Okay, so then we have several comments from Marcelo Longer. Would you like to say a few words? Make sure to unmute, or if I don't.
Okay.
Okay, there you go.
Okay.
And I'm reading your comments, Marcelo.
I'm not sure if I needed to start my video.
If you want, but yeah, not required. But it's always nice.
All right.
Totally up to you.
No, it's okay. I'm in 30 30 Celsius degree hot here in Brazil. That's okay. Different from you guys. Well, I've been working in forest management for more than 25 years here in Brazil, and I always worked with FFC standards and sometimes PFC standards. It's very common in forest FSC certificates companies or certified companies work with outsourcing or third parties or companies from other side of the out of the scams. But what we normally do is that the loggers or silviculture, any companies that we which work for forest companies will be attend the level, the minimal standards of FSC, and applying all the training, all the trains, all the procedures, all the laws, everything. So we have to make a very clear contract with all these aspects, including environmental, social standards that could ensure and guarantee the FSC standards. I'm talking about FSC certified companies, not all companies or forest companies in Brazil. Please bear this in mind. Yeah. I'm talking just for FSC certified companies.
Yep. So Marcelo, I see a couple.
And I was just telling.
No, go ahead. Finish your thought.
Yeah, you can tell. You can. No. I finish up. I finish.
Okay, great. Thanks, Marcelo. And I've worked a fair amount in Brazil, so muito obrigado. So the observation I would make, because one of the statements in the chat box says, from you, it says, we cannot extend the FSC to label to the loggers and suppliers, but we can request them to hold the same level of forest management, environmental, and social activities. The observation I would make is that loggers and forest contractors, and even smallholders, often feel that the power game isn't to their benefit. They feel that the large companies are the ones with the power, and they don't have the power, and they want to be more of an even playing field with them. So loggers here in the United States, it's a pretty big issue, similar to Southern Brazil, in that you have large companies by and large controlling what happens in forest management certification. Not always, but in most cases. And then loggers are, well, we'll tell you what to do, and then you'll do it, right? And they're like, wait a minute, we weren't asked to give our inputs. We don't have our own certification, which helps us gain credibility in the process, or even be, so there is a power dynamic. Others can speak better to that than me, like Dana from the Professional Logging Contractors of Maine, et cetera. So I think if the system can move in a direction where it recognizes those, and maybe in certain cases actually it would be to the benefit of the large companies for the subset companies or their suppliers to have certification, so that they don't have to always be, because as always happens in wood supply, sometimes they're bad actors. And sometimes a company that is trying to do the right thing has, 4 foresters and 10 loggers working for them, and one of those loggers does something bad, that then it paints the whole company as negative, because the actions that, well, maybe it would be more helpful if there's a direct certification contract and connection to the loggers, so that it's clear you're responsible, you have to perform. And when it comes to negotiating things with the FSC or buyers or others, they have more support and more organization to be able to be in a better negotiating position. The other thing, I'm going to jump, Connie, to the values question that Roland asked. And he said, which values are first you have what are called high conservation values. And note that those are not just biophysical, that some of those values are actually about communities and what resources matter most to communities. So I think those are the kinds of values. That's one set of values. And from my point of view, the values are kind of along the lines of my philosophy, which I pointed out. I gave that list of philosophical elements, which is that I think we need to walk in other people's shoes and understand things. But there may be other observations on the values piece, but that's just an initial response. Just one other observation there. That PEFC system has something called Forests of Exceptional Conservation Value, or FECV. The definitions of that are not as comprehensive as HEV, and there's more of a kind of it's become almost an expertise. HEV. I happen to think that if PEFC did one thing, well, they need to do a number of things to improve, but one and B is, why not just adopt HEVs in the PEFC system and try to figure out how to tweak their systems to address the HEVs. I know HEV stuff is complex in some respects. In other respects, I don't think it is. So that's an area where I think there could be commonality. And wouldn't it be nice to see both PEFC and FSC in the same boat, rowing the same direction on recognition and conservation of HEVs? Connie, where do you want to go next?
Well, maybe, yeah, we have a really mixed audience. Maybe just really briefly describe to people what HCVs are, because I don't know if everyone, even knows.
High conservation values, I think what are there, 7 or 8 now? I off the top of my head, I can't remember all the categories, but there are categories which are, for example, rare, threatened, endangered species. Then there's ecosystems at risk is another category of HEV. Community values is a category of HEV. So each of those categories has, in a sense, represents a value set. And what is required in the system is that for the forest manager to understand what those values are within the area of forest that they're managing, and then manage proactively to maintain those values, and even potentially conserve or restore some of those values which may have been at risk or are at risk at this point in time.
That's right. Those are in the FSC standards. And
that's right. And the HEV system is being being adopted in various certification systems, RSPO, Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, etc. So let's give credit where credit's due. FSC invented it, and then now it's become, there's an HCV resource network, and it's now going out and expanding way beyond. And you actually have people who have procurement systems that aren't certified at all, but they'll say, but we want to protect HCVs. So it's kind of interesting. It's not just a certification tool. It can be a tool for supply chains.
Great. Yeah. So a good example of an indirect effect of FSC beyond its borders. Yeah. So so Sophia Watkins, do you want to, and yeah, Sophia Watkins wants to say a few words, or?
Sure. Yeah. You've addressed most of the question already with your conversation about HCVs. I've been working at the deforestation forefront in Brazil, so it's cool to see Marcelo on the call. And it's one of the things I kind of rub up against. Renewable agriculture is very popular.
Yeah.
Right. There's some things that are much more salient within the conservation community. But then when you talk about wood extraction, that's it, kind of the walls go up. Right. And especially in really, really biodiverse rich regions like the Amazon, how do you react to those critiques?
So, and that's one of those contexts which is challenging, right? Because I can remember when we were starting the FSC, and a guy named Tasso Azevedo, who Connie knows, was creating a group in an organization in Brazil called Imaflora. And, and you probably know Imaflora. And he and I, when we did our first certificate for FSC in the Amazon, it was an organization called Precious Woods operating near Manaus. The German activist groups went crazy on us. They're like, what are you doing? Logging shouldn't even be happening in the Amazon. And our perspective was, honestly, you need to understand what's going on the ground more. And secondly, you need to understand what we're asking of this operation before it gets certified. And we'll say, but most importantly, get out there, see it. Ask questions based on knowledge rather than somebody claiming X, Y, or Z. And this is where at times I do differ from the campaigners. I believe campaigners by and large raise good issues, and they're the warning flag, the red flag or the yellow flag, that if we're not paying enough attention to them, we can be stupid and not pay attention to things that matter. But there are times that they have campaigns, and sometimes, just like any campaign, I'll just say that truth doesn't always come to the forefront for it. It's based on a campaign. They have objectives, and I understand that. But in the case, what we did in our case was Tasso called me up from Piracicaba and he said, "Hey, Richard, we're going to Germany. We're going to sit down with these people." So we met with Rette den Regenwald and Greenpeace Germany and etc. And first, what we tried to do was say, get a sense of, well, how much do you know the situation? How much have you been on the ground? Long story short, the end of the day, what ended up happening is that Greenpeace at one point took all their forest campaigners around the world and did their forest campaigner meeting at Precious Wood in Manaus, so that they could see. Some of them had never seen a tree being felled, and they didn't understand how Precious Woods was going on. Now, I don't mean to band-aid and therefore say everything Precious Woods does is, blessed by God and etc. But the point, I think, is to understand what's real and what's not. When there are people that are harvesting late successional old growth in the wetlands of the southeastern United States, that's a problem to me. And I think we need to be very careful to not say, oh, anything's acceptable because it might be X company saying something. The proof is in the pudding. Let's make sure we know what they're actually doing. Let's separate, as we would say in American, separate the wheat from the chaff. And I do think that the details matter. And Pará is different from, the other states. Every state is a little bit different in Brazil. So you got to understand that there are different dynamics in every state. And so if they're saying, in essence, logging has no place in the Amazon, there's a small detail, which is, guess what? There are people that live there, and they need timber and non-timber forest products. They need jobs and employment. So the question is how to evolve what has been an irresponsible activity to a responsible and hopefully even sustainable direction. This is the long course of history. I mean, I have enough training in history to know some things take a long time to change. And I think, John Palmer, been around for many, many years. He's seen a lot of change. I'm not, I'm a touch more junior than he is, but I still been around a long time. I would hope that by the time that you reach the age class distribution that I'm part of, that we will see fundamental change. I think as supply chains, retailers, buyers send messages that this is what matters to us, and civil society says climate change matters, renewability matters, sustainable social values matter, that will then begin to permeate the marketplace. But radical transparency like what Patagonia does with its supply chain for its different products, pretty cool. A lot of people said no one could ever do that because there'd be antitrust issues if they made it clear where they were getting all their stuff, and that somehow, well, they don't make their negotiation public, but they do say, you want to know where that jacket came from? Here's where we're getting it. Here's how it's being produced. That 20 years ago, that certainly would have been seen as radical transparency. I don't think it is so much anymore, but I still think it's an issue. The very long-winded answer to your question, I'm sorry, Sophia, but I just think we need to keep our nose to the grindstone on and going back to this question on equity and equitable access. If there are barriers, let's realize that those barriers are there for a certain reason. There may be vested interests that are causing those barriers to be there, and let's break through those.
And just quickly to add to that.
Yeah, go for it.
I guess the reason I'm grappling it with it so much is because smallholder farmers right now don't use their forest resources, right? This is the 80% that they have to maintain. Just getting a forest management plan for that is ridiculous.
Oh, it's ridiculous.
It just wouldn't happen.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
So it's kind of like this weird moral dilemma for me. if obviously I want a more sustainable use, and these small rural farmers are dealing with desertification, I mean, it's not sustainable to make much off of this land. So this could be a great incentive or added resource for them.
Or a different approach. And I'll just take your example. I was in Sumatra, southern Sumatra, going around visiting smallholder rubber operations. Well, guess what? They weren't just rubber operations. They had bees. They had, all sorts of things that they were doing on their property. Average size, 1 to 2 hectares. And somebody's coming to them and saying, well, you need a forest management plan. And they're like, we're not even speaking the same language. We're not even on the same game here. We need to do something different here. And that's where I think it needs to start. I think you have to do radically different solutions depending on scale, and you have to have benefits for it. So I will hold the company's feet to the fire in saying, you want sustainable harvesting? You want sustainable? Then by God, you better pay for it, because doing it right costs more money. And maybe over the long term, it may not, but in the short term, it does. There's no question. So at least in my mind, based on my field experience.
Great, thanks. So
good stuff. Good luck with your work. And if I can help in any other way offline, just you got the email there, so you know what to do.
Great. Okay.
I see 2 names who have hands up. Frank Miller, who's I think an old friend.
Sorry, there's one person here on the chat line that's been there for a while, and then maybe to the hands.
Go for it.
Sarah Cordovez, and then yeah.
Perfect.
Would you like to say something?
Go ahead, Sarah.
Hi. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah. I am very much, I feel like an infiltrator, because I'm very much a youth activist. Based around environmentalism, and this has been an incredibly informative and interesting talk. I'm based in Colombia as well, and I just wanted to put those questions and see whether I could be pointed in any interesting directions. Thank you so much for the talk.
Okay, so you are my #1 target audience. Let me just say that. When after doing stuff for so many years, I got, I now have grandkids who are ranging from 8 to 12 years old. You're older than them, but a lot younger than me. And one of the questions that one of my concerns globally is, I think for the first time in history, we are now more urban than we are rural. And what that means is a lot of people in urban locations don't understand where stuff comes from. Where's our water come from? Where's the paper come from? The wood come from? The oranges, the bananas, you name it. So I think that's where education comes in. I live in Vermont. I'm lucky, and we actually at the school where my 2 of my grandkids go, they have something called Forest Fridays. So every Friday they talk about forests, and actually they try to walk in the woods a little bit, or go out in the woods, or do something related to the woods. I want to see that be global, and I at times think it should be forest farms and Friday forums and farms and forests, because there's a lot of misunderstanding on agriculture, and everyone could benefit from that. I want to answer, you raised a couple different questions, and I'm not going to try to answer all of them. But I do think on your third question, which you say, which conversation needs to happen within environmentalism, start dealing with the stigmatization of forest management as it relates to the loss of biodiversity. There's 2 conversations at least that need to happen. First, the forestry community has a responsibility to address and demonstrate to you how they're attacking that problem. And I put that responsibility clearly on their shoulders. I was in Chile in March, right before COVID hit in full force, and I'd go into bathrooms and restaurants, etc., and there were signs that said "No a los forestales," no to foresters, no to timber harvesting, no to this or that. And I understood where that was coming from, but I also think that a conversation with responsible actors, that's why when I say invest in the leaders, you are a potential leader. I think that you need to talk with the leaders in that commercial forestry sector to be talking to each other and work with the leaders, because the leaders will dictate what the followers do. At least that's my hypothesis. The other question is whether that I thought you asked a bunch of them, but I'm gonna try to hit. There was another one I wanted to hit, which was climate change and deforestation. So certification, and there's a guy named Robert Rubies, who Connie also knows, who was very involved in FSC and is semi-retired now. He's out in California. He was with Scientific Certification Systems. And one of the things that he and I have agreed upon is that one of the challenges is, what are the forest practices that enhance or degrade greenhouse gases at the forest management level? I was in BC, where Connie studied at one point and lived, and I was amazed. I went out in the forest and I still saw people collecting coarse woody debris, putting it in a pile and burning it. Now, in some respects, because of fire risk, I can understand that to some extent, but by and large, I don't accept it. I think it's an old practice. I think it needs to change. Well, what are the other forest management actions that can enhance greenhouse gas conservation? Well, maybe we change rotation lengths to foster lake successional old growth. Maybe we reestablish riparian zones, which have a value not only for greenhouse gases, but also for wildlife conservation and water quality. So there are a variety of forest practices. So I think one of the things that we have a responsibility as forest managers to do is identify the practices that can more favorably affect the climate dynamic. Little things like, believe it or not, there's now vegetable oil that can be used to run chainsaws. Well, maybe we want to go to doing that instead of using fossil fuel based bar and chain oil. I mean, it sounds simple. It sounds simplistic and minute, but it's those little things. I think the one thing we know about climate change is the change is going to be happening because of a whole bunch of small actions done by a whole variety of parties. And every little bit we do matters. So I think the FSC, PEFC systems need to incorporate forest management practices that will make forestry more climate resilient and climate positive. Go down to the ground level, at the forest level, do it, make it happen. Maybe someday we'll see all electric harvesting vehicles. I don't think we're so far away from that. I don't think anyone thought we'd be where we are with electric vehicles and the opportunities today versus 10 years ago. So maybe 10 years from now, virtually all those harvesters will be electric. Hopefully that helps a little bit. Thanks for being on the call, by the way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gracias.
And so apologies, because I'm not seeing, for some reason, I'm not seeing the hand raises, but if you can see them.
There was one that was, and I'm not sure he's still there, was Frank Miller. And then there's Emily Royenestad Tompkins. I'm not sure where Emily is. I know the Tompkins name, so I'm wondering. But do you see that? Oh, there's Mr. Miller. There's Mr. Miller. I see him.
Hi.
Hey, Frank.
Hi, Richard. How are you?
I'm great.
Yeah, I do remember coming to stay with you many, many years ago in Vermont. And
right.
It must have been about this time of year, actually. But yeah, there's a couple of points. I agree. I think any certification program involving stuff that has an impact on climate change has to involve that now, because that is going to be the big driver of all laws and regulations, the way that companies look at natural resources. You know, if you look at Responsible Steel program, a big chunk of what they do in their principles and criteria is around greenhouse gas production. So if,
there you go.
Unless certification programs want to become irrelevant, they have to incorporate climate change. Another point I'd just like to sort of ask you about, what you think about, is I feel that the certification bodies are really holding back certification and the development of certification in many ways, because they all incorporate, you know, their business model is about getting auditors out in the field, is about charging man-day rates, it's about doing this once a year on-site audit where they have loads of people and teams and all the rest of it. To me, that is just so outdated now, because there's so many more ways to collect data. But it's those big companies, and I used to work for one for 10 years, for SGS, I helped set up their certification program. It's that, you know, they are holding stuff back because they've always been technophobes, and they're used to that business model, and that's what they want to maintain. Surprise, surprise. I think, you know, assessing a site once a year, is that enough? No, of course it's not. You know, but there are other ways of doing stuff. There's some really interesting companies out there that are using workers to collect very simple data sets through text messaging. You know, that's where we have to go. And but I think the certification bodies are going to be a real drag on things because they don't want stuff to change. That's my humble
you know,
opinion.
You're not surprised. You're not going to be surprised because I'm on the same wavelength. I actually, you know, basically certification bodies almost work on basically a time and materials basis.
Yeah.
So if the budget can be bigger, it's better for them.
Absolutely.
Generally speaking, and I think we have to attack that. But the system, I've now come to the conclusion after 30 years of doing it that I see certification systems as inherently conservative and risk aversive.
Yeah.
And if they open up the box of doing something different, everybody gets, we would say in American, the heebie-jeebies. Oh God, no, you're not gonna, you know. And I think we need to look at this different. And now I'm going to jump to a question that John asked. He basically says, if I was a Mapuche, I would not be happy to talk with the forest plantation companies taking my water supply in southern Chile. Absolutely agree. And think that when we do the audits of those companies, that should be one of those core or critical criteria that we're examining. Because we sometimes, and I've been an auditor, you've written those audit reports, you're asking to address 70 different criteria, probably 250 indicators. And the ones that matter the most, you know what, in the scheme of things, you got to cover them all.
Yeah.
And that's actually required by FSC. From my point of view, I know that the annual audits can do more focusing rather than the initial 5-year assessments. I mean, we're getting a little technically wonky here, but the point being that I think there is a better, more efficient, and more issues-based way of doing things in a more rigorous way. And God knows with everything, and I know there can be a negative dynamic with what do you call the things that fly up in the air?
Drones.
Yeah, with drones and all that, they bring up negative connotations that we have to be careful about. But there's an incredibly great opportunity. One observation I would make, however, and I just went through a process of examining this further, and I would love to be proven wrong, is that when I had conversations with WRI and a guy named Matt Hansen at the University of Maryland and others, that one of the things that remote sensing does a pretty good job of is forest conversion to plantations or non-forest conditions. Remote sensing still isn't very good at dealing with degradation.
Yeah.
And it's awful for social issues.
Yeah.
And I think that the implication is, oh, if we just could use technology better, that will be the answer on social issues. Not convinced.
No.
Not saying it can't be used, but let's be careful about what we expect there, because I think something different needs to happen there. And let's also realize the disparate access that rural communities have to internets. Yep. and using these tools, because there is a big, huge issue. It's a political issue here in the United States, rightfully. It's a political issue in my state, rightfully.
But there's still a hell of a lot of mobile phones around, you know, and text messaging, etc. You don't have to have smartphones to basically to be able to send information.
That's right. And there's a guy I know, Andrew Dudley, who's also involved in that Earth Live stuff, and he's been working on some platforms for that as well as others. Yeah. Where do you want to go next? Thanks, Frank. Great to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too.
Thanks, great conversation. So yeah, Emily, I think you've had your hand up for quite a while. Emily
Tompkins.
Yeah, Tompkins. I think I just was.
That's all right. You there, Emily? You got to unmute yourself. You might be self-muted, Emily.
Or maybe she went away for a little while.
No, she's still. Oh, she might have gone and got a cup of coffee.
Yeah. So let's see. Yeah, because I see the hands now.
I'm looking in the chat to see if there's other.
Yeah. Well, one thing. I mean, I can ask a question if that's all right.
Go for it. Oh, I guess that's appropriate.
Yeah. I use my.
Why not?
Use my privilege here. But well, so I mean, I'm really excited, you know, for example, about this idea of logger certification as sort of part of the really huge question of equity. It has so many dimensions to it. And also in reference to another question that someone else asked, you know, it could seem that, I mean, I've talked to loggers where they felt somewhat resentful that why is the company getting certified? I have to be highly skilled to do this work. I actually make a lot of decisions in the field and I need to be recognized. So on the one hand, I think, you know, one solution to this is to make the benefits of certification available to more and more people in the puzzle, more and more contractors, et cetera. But there's another side to it. You know, I don't know if you've seen the book, Audit Explosion by I think Michael Powers.
I have not.
Yeah, but this sort of unintended effect of, yeah, I definitely recommend it. I think he's from the LSE or UCL over here in the UK.
I'll find it.
So yeah, so just there is a challenge, you know, to hammer everything as a nail that, you know, auditing and standards and certification are, you know, the main tool that we have. And then it starts becoming a sort of public expectation that everyone must be certified. So, and then that inevitably, even if you improve your systems, excludes a lot of people who may actually be practicing very good land management. They can afford to be certified. There's no incentive, whatever else. So is there a danger in this of a sort of audit explosion in using, you know, certification as sort of the main tool to recognize good practice, or are there other ways of recognizing good practice?
So I think this is a really fertile ground for change. And I think that we really need to go a different direction here. First, anytime we talk about streamlining certification systems, the immediate response is, oh, you're going to reduce rigor. I don't see it that way. I see it as focusing on the issues that really matter more. It doesn't mean those other things drop off the table completely, because you've always got that menu there that if something changes and if you're in touch, then you know, you can bring those issues to the fore when they're necessary. But I do think on a jurisdictional or regional level, we should, the game, maybe these are the wrong words and people will not like it because I refer to it as almost a transaction, but the deal that has to be done is engage in certification. What we will do if you do that is we're also going to reduce the burden for stakeholders, for applicants, et cetera. And we're going to focus on the issues that in your particular jurisdiction matter. Now, in order to do that, you have to have standards that are built on jurisdiction. Well, we have those in essence, but I still don't think they go hard enough at the topic of critical criteria. Rainforest Alliance put this in their ag program a number of years ago. I still think they have too many critical criteria because they did it at the global level. And I think that that's not the way to do it. You should be doing critical criteria at either a jurisdiction and ecosystem or some sub-global level in order to be more effective. So I think that there's huge opportunity there. And because I can remember going out, just many audits, I see Star Childs is on there. I can remember going out and talking to him before an audit happened or audit class or something. And it was like, what's this long list of all the things you got to look at? Why do those matter in my particular context? And the honest answer is they don't, some of them. But there are other ones where if we take there's only so much, and to give auditors some credit, sometimes they have to work with this because they will be told by FSC or PEFC, you got to make sure your report covers every single indicator under there. And if you don't, we're going to whack you. We're going to be difficult for you. Whereas an auditor may say, yeah, but the issues here are about free, prior, and informed consent or forest degradation high grading. I need to spend more of my time focused on those. In the annual audits, in theory, you have the flexibility to do that, at least in the FSC system. I hope that happens in PEFC as well. But in the original 5-year renewing, these assessments that happen every 5 years, you don't have that option by and large. And I think, I also happen to think that the systems are a little too global sometimes. I think the management system in FSC needs to be more regionally adjusted. I think there needs to be more decision-making further out in countries and regions. But that's a longer conversation. And not that that can be pretty intricate and perhaps, not fair. We don't have enough time to cover it. So I just think it's really important that we continue to examine. I do, like you, I think I worry that sometimes I just was interviewed by somebody who was operating it, I would say, almost in the stars today. And they were talking about issues where I kind of felt like they weren't very grounded. And I was like, and they were talking about supply chains and what needs to happen from a sustainability point of view. And so this goes back to Sarah, I think. One of my recommendations is get out on the ground with people who are of disparate opinions and understand what they're doing and what they're not doing and why. Because I've been out with social scientists focused on indigenous issues in Paraguay, a lawyer, human rights lawyer. He produced a report. Hey, there he is. Where he produced a report back in 1978 or 79 for the U.S. Congress on human rights in Paraguay, and I was in the field with him as a translator, from Spanish, English to Guarani, and I was there making sure that the translators were accurate, and he wrote a report that was absolute, complete BS. Now, how did that affect me? And we were visiting Christian immigrant, indigenous communities, and I'm no great fan sometimes of the proselytizing that happens with indigenous groups from religious groups, but he wrote stuff that was just absolutely false and not true. And the people that were out in the community were trying to improve the health conditions for indigenous groups that were becoming sedentary for the first time in their tribe's history. So I've learned over time to throw away my preconceptions of left and right, religious and non-religious, people they may be conservative Republicans who are highly religious, and yet they're giving me the best information on what's going on the ground. And this was the experience I was going to refer to, Connie. I once did an audit in BC, and you may remember this. What's his name wrote a book on the group that was not Mennonite, but they were, it was an organization that is basically misogynistic in terms of the way that the women played. What's his name, the author? And we did an audit, and the community basically said to us, how can you certify this operation or even audit it when there are misogynistic loggers doing all the harvesting? And I said, I got to go back to the standards, and I got to see how that reflects to the way that they treat the people that work for them or the landowners they're working with. And if I see evidence that those issues are there, then I got something I can work with. But if it's purely a philosophical point of you don't agree with them politically, that's a different game. And that's not what auditing of forest management is about. I don't see it as a political game. I see it as something that's about practice and what you do on the ground. Sorry if I can't remember the name of the book. It's a great book, and the author is someone who's done some pretty good stuff. But that's just an example of where dogma might take us a certain direction in terms of how we ultimately decide on our results, and we have to avoid that. We can't. That's something we can't get caught in that box. Where else you want to take it?
Yeah.
How are we doing time wise? When do we have to?
I think we're about, probably about ready to wrap up. But Starling, did you want to say something?
Oh, you got to unmute yourself, Starling.
Hi, right. Yeah, I think it also raises, these challenging issues around the boundaries of certification and what it can and can't address.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yes.
Oh, and one thing that came out that I've come to understand, and I think that unfortunately we have seen the striking importance of governments when we look at a place like Brazil and what the difference has been on the ground in the forest under the current president versus previous presidents and what has happened there. And I'm not in Brazil enough to know day to day what the other positives or negatives of Bolsonaro have been, but I can say from a forest point of view and a climate point of view, it has not been positive. And on the ground stuff of the people I'm talking to say to me, this is not what we need to be doing. to improve the world from a climate change point of view, or for that matter, just a governance perspective. But what it reinforces is the importance of government. And that's where FSC has a challenge, because it has never formally said, government, you are a chamber or you are part of a chamber, only kind of nuancing it a bit. That's for good reasons. I was involved in some of those decisions originally, and I understand why. Because as an old friend, you may remember him, David Harcharik, who used to be at the U.S. Forest Service. He's passed away. He used to run international forestry at the U.S. Forest Service. He said, Richard, what you're doing, creating the FSC, is wonderful. But whatever you do, God help you, don't have government leading. Because if you do, their mandate is lowest common denominator. And that's what they're going to try to do. Now, that may be right or wrong, but that's where that informed why FSC to some extent has taken the approach it has. Starry, you got something?
No, I'm just enjoying catching up. I came in late, but obviously you're probably involved with some of these carbon certification,
exactly,
which is a whole nother ball game. And we went down that road. Yeah.
Well, and it's crazy. Connie, I'm sure you've been exposed to this. We have carbon systems that are, and there's some interesting new approaches being developed by the American Tree Farm System, American Forest Foundation, and TNC and others here in the United States, which may get us to a point. But if you look at what's required to get a red offset, I mean, it's borderline insane. Now, you could take any individual requirement and say that, oh, that's for a good reason. But when the cumulative impact is just so heavy that people just walk away from it and say the only people making money here are the auditors and the consultants. Nobody else is making money. Landowners aren't making money. And so that's a fundamental problem. Equity issue.
That's right. Good. An excellent sort of closing statement, if I could, and also invite everyone, Richard included, Star, everybody, to join us on other OCTF events and carry on the conversation, because I think there's just so much material to talk about here, and I really enjoyed this. And thanks so much to everybody, and to Richard, and hi, Advinder, if you have any closing statements or, yeah.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting.
Great. So, okay, good. Well, we've had a good long conversation, and I really look forward to seeing everybody again. And let's carry on the conversation.
Yeah, and so Connie, my last is to the people in Sarah's generation.
Right.
Get out in the field, learn another language. It looks like she already has Spanish and English, so she's going in the right direction. And go out and be with people who aren't of the same perspective as you, because that's, go out with those Darth Vader loggers, go out with those Darth Vader foresters, or for that matter, everyone sees each other as potentially Darth Vader. Just get out there and see things, and do it with quality. Do it with time. Don't go out, oh, I'm just going to do a week, be out there, that'll be done. No, go out and do a significant amount of time, because every time I do it, I'm 68 years old. I still keep learning. It's fun. Thanks, Connie. Thanks, Evinder.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks everybody. Okay. Bye.
Peace. Great to see you, Star, Frank.
Good to see
John,
you. Yeah.
etc.
Great to see you. What a riot.